Hi, this is Dave Thomas from GOTO Chicago. It's my pleasure to be spending a few minutes interviewing Russ Olsen and Jessica Kerr. Jessica's just giving a talk on functional programming for those of us that were stateful sinners. And Russ, has, of course, at Cognitec's been working on moving from Ruby to probably Clojure.
There's a rumor to that effect, yeah.
So thought maybe you could just share a little of your experience about the transitions, what it's been like and so on. And now, of course, I can see more in your talk in particular, but perhaps you just give us a quick synopsis of what you think the key steps are.
To transition from object-oriented to functional programming?
Yes.
Well, first I'll say that object-oriented programming totally has its place. In Reed's talk today, he talked about remote procedure calls and the boundaries of where function calls and procedure calls become not realistic. And so object-oriented totally has its place. Message passing is awesome, but I think as we've gotten more and more into objects, we've forgotten that while we are in the same process, functional composition is really useful. And the good part is that we don't have to switch languages in order to use the style of functional programming, especially with Java 8 coming out. That's very exciting, and C# already has lambdas. So in my talk tomorrow...
Presuming there's a good implementation.
Oh, of course it's going to be great. They've been working on it long enough. In my talk tomorrow, I really emphasize how it's not about the language as much as it is about a way of thinking. Some languages make that easier than others. I just switched to Clojure in my day job.
Oh, there you go.
But we can think about reducing our mutable state and increasing our use of data in, data out functions to improve all of our code, even when we're sticking with our object-oriented paradigm, because there is great value in that paradigm anyway.
One of the things that I think about when I think about people moving from object-oriented programming to functional programming is it's sort of a process of disassembly. I'm kind of really interested in how people look at these things, and I think traditional object-oriented programming is kind of this package of solutions. There's objects and there's data encapsulation and there's methods. And when you move to functional programming, what you're really doing is you're pulling those things apart so that you can have polymorphism without the objects, or you can hide the data or not hide the data. And it really disassembles the pieces that are sort of traditionally together in object-oriented programming. And I think it's for me, it's really interesting to watch people get that and realize they can use these tools separately instead of all sort of packaged up.
That we can pass verbs as well as nouns.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that kind of takes the position that's a little different from the Haskell school of thinking, where basically, really, there should be no mutable state.
Don't tell the Haskellers we're compromising.
Except in a monad,
Yeah, that is a position. Yeah, at least for me, I guess I do see this through Clojure-colored eyes. I see that you can build a lot of your program with immutable data and functions, but in the end, there are things changing in the world, and you should just admit there are things changing in the world and model it that way.
Right, but isolate that and call it out.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have to do that with the monad. And the other part, and with mutable state in Java, it's really painful to make everything immutable in a way that's enforced by the compiler, but we can choose not to mutate it.
Right, and I suppose that's the difference between Java and Clojure, for example, is it's really a question of defaults, where in Java, all the state's mutable by default, and you can work hard to make it immutable, where in Clojure, it's all immutable by default, and the special case is the immutable state.
So the been joked, and I think it's actually a fact, that basically design patterns in OO are just idioms in a reasonable programming language.
Design patterns are a language smell. And
What-
some of them just go away in a functional language.
Well, maybe we were talking about definitions here, but as the guy who wrote the book on Ruby design patterns, let me disagree.
Okay.
I think, so maybe this is a definitional thing, but I think that design patterns really are the idioms in a programming language, and the idioms can be more complicated or less complicated. So I always smile when I get to the end of a 600-page Clojure book, which is full of, this is how we do it in Clojure. Do it this way. This is the way it's done in Clojure. And then in the last few pages, they'll say, and there's no design patterns in Clojure. Well, it's 600 pages of design patterns. They're just simple, easy to use.
Well, I think they're really not design patterns. The problem is they're really language idioms.
Yeah.
And the problem is they're just not available in the OO language. So they become a pattern or style in
Yes.
the OO language.
Yeah.
One thing I've learned from the Ruby community is that they have really strong idioms, and the Rubyists use discipline to not do a lot of the crazy stuff that Ruby will totally let them
Right,
do.
yes.
And they've developed this as a community, and I really love that about Ruby.
Yeah, I think the Ruby people got a few things right. Well, I think they got lots of things right. And one of the things that I like is just they settled on like code conventions very early on, and so there's not the interminable arguments about what the code should look like. There's a little bit of that, but not a whole bunch. And I think that's a real value, and I think that's carrying over in the Clojure world, where you don't have these enormous arguments about where the parentheses goes. People just agree.
Around.
Yeah.
They go around.
Yeah, they go around, yes.
Now, one of the main approaches to using functional programming is to use the types to help you do the design. This is really something that's very strong in the Haskell school and Scala, since it's based on Haskell, and F#, which is really based on OCaml, but itself related. How does that fit with your, how important is it to see the type system and sort of think in types, do you think, in functional programming? Or is that just something extra on top?
So I just switched from Scala to Clojure, and I already missed the type system. However, I found that just yesterday I had a fairly complicated problem, and to see how it fit together, I wrote the types down in my notebook, recognized an applicative functor, Googled that, found the right function to do the transposition in Clojure. And so the types, looking at them helped me recognize the problem, but I didn't have to look at them in the language. I just looked at them on a piece of paper, and that was sufficient. So just because your language isn't enforcing the types doesn't mean you can't think that way.
Have you used core.type at all?
I have not. I am a longtime Rubyist, so the types just sort of look to me like a lot of baggage and
Extra ceremony.
yeah, and I could be wrong. It could be just the background, the baggage that I'm carrying into the language, but type systems just always seem to me to be either trivial and in the way, say the Java one, where it's not really helping me and it's just all ceremony, or if they're really going to help me, they're so complicated that they're not helping me anymore, if you follow me. That if they're complicated or strong enough that they're actually do you some good, they're really hard to manipulate.
We just did Lambda Jam in Australia. We'll do it here again in Chicago in July, so if you want to see some great functional programmers in Chicago,
I'll be there for that.
So I think one of the discussions we had is the approach that I'm familiar with for learning scheme, and also used in teaching old array languages like J and APL and so on, was what you did is you learned the kind of the kata or the idioms of the language by doing lots of small exercises and expressions, right? So just as you do in karate, you become, it becomes reflex to do these things and put together the idioms, and you sort of learn how to work with collections, right? Essentially, you don't actually think about, okay, do I need a flat map or whatever it is, and that's the way, in the old days, the books like The Little Schemer and so on, things like that, really got you into doing lots and lots of exercises. And after that, you were kind of comfortable kind of speaking in the language, and then you could actually sort of start designing programs. Have you seen anything like that in the approaches that you use? Is that something you...
I know there are similar kinds of things in Clojure. There's sort of progressive exercises.
Foreclosure.com
Yeah,
is one.
yeah, that kind of thing. Again, I think it really depends on your learning style, right? I'm sort of a
Sure.
give me a big project person, but
Oh, you prefer a big one.
yeah, sort of give me a big problem and I'll do it 14 times and figure out how to do it right on that 15th try.
Yeah. So
Maybe-
I've read that. So we do things the way our brain works, and our brain works the way we do things. And that what surprised me was when I read that the best way to train your brain in a new way of thinking is just to do it. Do it with your hands, and then your neurons will conform, and then you'll be able to do it faster, and that part of the effort will fall away. So I mean, I agree with you. I think that just doing it is the best way. And I think I wish a lot more workplaces would give developers time to experiment, because frankly, if you don't give me time to experiment on something of my choosing, I'm going to experiment in your business code. So
You're going to get the
Consider that.
experiments anyway,
Right.
right?
yes,
yeah.
you're going to get them and they're going to hurt.
Right.
Yeah.
The question is whether they're in production or not.
Either that or you're not learning anything, and that's also terrible.
Well, I think we're out of time, but I want to thank you both for sharing your thoughts. I think this is
Thank
very
you.
interesting
Thank
for
you.
those of you particularly transitioning from Ruby and looking at languages like probably more like Clojure than Scala or Haskell, or F#, but who knows? So I think we've got two great speakers here that clearly demonstrate that the journey is not so difficult, and as usual, there may still be some place for objects and messages along with your functions. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.